In 1987, a single vote, 12-11, killed one of the most advanced fighter jets the world had ever seen. The plane had already flown. It was brilliant. Test pilots called its handling superb, and the country that destroyed it wasn't an enemy. It was the closest ally of the nation that built it, the United States. Israel had poured around $2 billion into this jet, and here's the strange part. Most of that money was American. The United States had funded the very aircraft it then forced Israel to cancel. Why would America pay to build a world-class fighter, then strangle it in the cradle? And why, a few years later, did a brand new jet appear on the other side of the planet, in communist China, that looked like the dead Israeli plane's identical twin? This is the story of the Lavi, the fighter that was too good to be allowed to live, and the Chinese jet it may have secretly become. America spent billions helping Israel build a world-class fighter, then spent its political muscle making sure it died. To understand the betrayal, you have to understand just how good this plane was. By the 1980s, Israel was no longer content to fly American hand-me-downs. It wanted its own world-class fighter, designed for its own brutal wars, and it built one. They called it the Lavi, Hebrew for lion cub. It had a sleek delta wing paired with small forewings called canards, making it astonishingly agile. In fact, it was deliberately built to be aerodynamically unstable, a plane that wanted to tumble out of control, then tamed by a lightning-fast computerized flight system correcting it hundreds of times a second. Its electronics rivaled the most advanced versions of America's own F-16. It carried a heavy payload, flew far, and when it first took to the sky on the final day of 1986, test pilots came back raving. There was just one catch. Israel couldn't afford it alone. Roughly 90% of the Lavi's funding came from American military aid, and American companies were lined up to build half the aircraft. Israel hadn't just built a fighter with America's blessing, it had built one with America's wallet. And that turned out to be the trap, because the people writing those checks were about to realize what they were paying for. Here's what Washington slowly understood. The Lavi wasn't just a fighter for Israel. It was a future competitor. On the global arms market, America sold the F-16 by the thousands, one of the most lucrative defense exports on Earth. And the Lavi, with its modern avionics and longer range, was shaping up to be a jet other countries might buy instead. American defense firms were furious that their own taxpayers' money was funding a rival to their flagship product. The Lavi's crime wasn't that it was bad. It was that it was good enough to steal the F-16's customers. At the same time, costs had spiraled out of control. Israel had sunk $2 billion into the program before a single production jet was built, straining a small economy already spending a staggering share of its wealth on defense. Caught between brutal arithmetic and intense American pressure, the Israeli cabinet went to a vote in August 1987. The Lavi lost by a single ballot, 12-11. The decision left scars that lasted decades. One of its champions insisted Israel had thrown away the most advanced fighter in the world. The jet was dead. It should have vanished into history. Instead, something began stirring thousands of miles away. A few years after the Lavi died, China unveiled an ambitious new fighter of its own, the Chengdu J-10. And anyone who knew the Lavi did a double take. There it was, the same sleek delta wing, the same small canards near the nose, the same general silhouette of the Israeli jet that had supposedly been buried in 1987. The resemblance was too strong to ignore, and the rumors started almost immediately. In 1988, a British newspaper reported that Israel and China had quietly agreed to develop a fighter based on the Lavi. Years later, Russian engineers claimed the J-10 was more or less a version of the Israeli plane. Then, in 2008, The respected defense publication Jane's dropped a bombshell. It reported that China's program had received direct input from the Lavi project, including allegedly access to an actual Lavi prototype sitting inside a Chinese facility, along with detailed design and wind tunnel data. A fighter Israel had buried in 1987 seemed to claw its way out of the grave a decade later, wearing a red star. But before we call it a clone, we have to be honest, because the truth is messier and far more interesting than a simple copy. China has always flatly denied it. The J-10's own chief designer insisted the plane descended from an earlier canceled Chinese project from the 1960s that also used canards, not from the Lavi at all. And the skeptics have a point. The J-10 is not a Lavi with Chinese paint. It's noticeably bigger and heavier. And crucially, it was built around a Russian engine, not the American one that powered the Lavi. A true clone, this is not. But here's where it gets uncomfortable for China's story. Israel and China absolutely did have a secret defense relationship in that era, one that ran for years before the two countries even formally recognized each other. Israel had already sold China the technology behind one of its deadly air-to-air missiles, which China turned into a weapon of its own, along with a notorious attack drone. This was not a one-off favor. It was a quiet pipeline of Western-grade military know-how flowing east, at a time when Beijing was desperate to leap a generation ahead and had no one else willing to help. Against that backdrop, the idea that nothing at all passed from the Lavi to the J-10 becomes very hard to believe. And many analysts and former US officials believe Israeli engineers quietly helped China crack the hardest problems of modern fighter design. The tricky canard delta aerodynamics, the unstable but agile layout, the computerized flight controls. The honest verdict is the unsatisfying one. The J-10 is not a Lavi clone, but it was almost certainly touched by the ghost of one. There's no smoking gun proof that full blueprints changed hands, and there probably never will be because both sides have every reason to deny it. Whatever the exact truth, the consequences would arrive decades later, written in the sky. For most of its life, the J-10 was an unproven question mark, a jet that had never fired a shot in a real war. For decades, critics in the West dismissed it as a cheap knockoff, a second-rate fighter that would crumble the moment it met a real Western jet. That reputation changed in the spring of 2025. During a sharp military clash between India and Pakistan, Pakistan's Air Force flew its Chinese-built J-10s into combat for the first time. And Pakistan claimed something explosive, that its J-10s, firing long-range Chinese missiles from beyond visual range, had shot down several of India's prized French Rafale fighters, some of the most expensive and respected warplanes in the world. India disputed the account, and the full truth remains contested to this day. But the claim alone sent shockwaves through the defense world, forcing analysts who had mocked the jet for years to suddenly take it seriously. And the value of the company that builds the J-10 reportedly surged overnight. Now, step back and look at the full circle. The fighter the West helped kill in 1987 may have, decades later, shot Western-built fighters out of the sky. A jet whose DNA allegedly traces back to an American-funded Israeli program. Reborn in China, possibly drawing first blood against a European warplane. If the Lavi connection is real, it is one of the strangest arcs in all of modern military history. So follow the thread one last time. America funds an Israeli super fighter. America then forces that fighter to die, to protect the sales of its own F-16. The technology, allegedly, slips eastward and is reborn in China as the J-10. And decades later, that very jet may be knocking Western fighters out of the sky. Here's the lesson buried in all of it. In the world of weapons, you can cancel a program, you can shred the contracts, you can win the vote. but you cannot always kill an idea. Knowledge, once it exists, has a way of resurfacing exactly where you least want it to. To be clear, much of this story remains officially denied and impossible to prove. But the pattern is very hard to ignore. Next, we go after China's biggest secret of all, the stealth fighter the Pentagon actually fears, the J-20. You won't want to miss it. Stick around.